Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Partially, diplomacy is something that was invented for monarchs and various of their representatives to be able to talk to each other. And a more recent description by one of my former colleagues was diplomacy is useful when you want to talk to people you really don't like. I think it's obviously a very important tool. I teach a course at Georgetown, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some other country to do what you want or think what you want. And so what are the tools? And there are not a lot of things. The course is called the National Security Toolbox, and there are not a lot of tools in it. There is diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. Then there are economic tools, either carrots like aid and trade or sticks when you take them away, the threat of the use of force, law enforcement, and intelligence. That's it. And ultimately, what one sees is that diplomacy continues to be the basic tool that is required to make the other ones work. Right. Now, Americans do have a tendency, I think, to make lists and check them off and see that they are done. And yet, I have found that things never really are quite done, that they need to continue to be managed in a variety of ways. And let's take, for instance, the Balkans. I think there were really a sense when, after the war in Kosovo, that it was done. And yet what we're finding now is obviously the importance of continuing to look at how the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia works. The EU is very important in that. Diplomacy and having people be able to have a moderator in it or some diplomatic aspect. So I think Americans, while we do like to check off lists, I think that we also understand the value of talking. The thing that's hard, and I always end up blaming the media, but not usually in the first question, is that part of it is that diplomatic activities are always covered. People, the question is, what did you just accomplish? Yeah. What came out of this meeting? And if there's not a specific result, then people say diplomacy failed. And people are asking what happened in Almaty over the P5+1 on Iran. It's part of a process. Nothing failed. Yep. And I think that, so that's part of why people say it's kind of just talking and it doesn't get you anywhere.
And I suppose part of the criticism that was made in the UK and the US and other places of President Obama's first term was perhaps that impression that not as many things as some people had hoped would get done got done. And yet, I think one of the things that's been most defining of that first term was the re-engagement of the United States in the Asia-Pacific. Now, do you see that engagement in the Asia-Pacific, whether it's as a response to China or just a rebalancing back to where things should have been in any case? Is that an example then of a sort of diplomacy as engagement, as managing relationships, rather than as achieving things?
Well, first of all, I think managing does actually achieve things in the end, so I wouldn't have it as such a strong dichotomy. I think, frankly, the Obama administration had to get over the Bush administration, and so part of the issue here was how to re-engage the United States in partnerships with other countries and to do what makes an incredible amount of sense, is to see that China is the power that one has to deal with, and trying to sort out what the different approaches are. Plus, generally, as I have said, the United States is not monogamous. We are an Atlantic and a Pacific power. And I think that it's very important to try to see how diplomacy in both areas can help really, you know, you think of diplomacy in many different ways. Some of it is just discussion, yep, putting issues on the table. And for me, the most important part of diplomacy is not just delivering a message, but actually listening to what the people on the other side of the table are saying, and getting that exchange of views and kind of setting the table and learning about what the needs are. And I think that that's something that the Obama administration has really done, is kind of recalibrate where we need to pay attention. The truth is we have to pay attention everywhere. And then Secretary Clinton, I think, was absolutely amazing in terms of her capability of going to places and not just engaging with the government officials, but also doing something that's essential in the 21st century, is listening to civil society, getting the views of people and connecting in that particular way. So we now talk about public diplomacy,
Yep.
some of which is obviously done through the media and a variety of ways, and trying to hear what the other society is saying. So diplomacy has gotten larger, and I think that's true in Asia as well as in Europe and Africa and Latin America.
One of the big things that, and we had a speech here from Anne-Marie Slaughter, who just presented the QDDR, I think it's diplomacy and
Right.
development. I mean, again, this has been a re-articulation, I suppose, of where diplomacy maybe fits in. How do you see that diplomacy and development connection? Is this something new? Is this just a continuation of the past?
Well, what is interesting about that, it was modeled on the fact that the Defense Department does has a quadrennial defense review. And so it's interesting to see how things evolve. When I was secretary, one of the things I wanted to do was to try to get more coordination among the various parts of our government and trying to understand what it is that we were doing in development and diplomacy and democracy, and how they fit together. I actually wish that this had been the QDDDR, adding the fourth D, defense, development, democracy, diplomacy, together. But I do think that it's a very important part to see the kind of combination and collection of the tools,
Yes.
because you really do need them. And part of the problem was also trying to get the other branch of the U.S. government, Congress, to understand that the development budget had to be funded, and that development was something that was part of the national security toolbox, and seeing how they fit together.
You brought democracy up there, and I think this is probably one of the more challenging dimensions at the moment of international relations, both for Europe and for the United States. We seem to see governments that are authoritarian, China, that are looking for ways to be representative. We have governments in the Middle East that are transitioning from authoritarian to democratic, but who are struggling to be democratic and deliver. I mean, do you think when you raise democracy like that, it almost looks as the next stage where we should be trying to get the world to go? Is that viable? I mean, how do you see democracy manifesting itself? And it's a big question, but it must be absolutely fundamental.
You'll be so sorry you asked me that. I am chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, and it's an organization that actually started as a result of a speech that President Reagan gave here at Westminster in 1983. And he was talking about the fact that democracies were not good at explaining themselves vis-a-vis communism. So he went back to the United States and he started the National Endowment for Democracy. And it had 4 institutes under it: Democrats and Republicans, business, and labor. And I was the original vice chair of the National Democratic Institute. And the truth is we didn't have a clue what to do because American political parties are so different from European ones. And so we began to discuss, believe it or not, what democracy was about. And everybody said, well, elections. Well, elections are necessary but not sufficient. So we then began to say, obviously, one of the elements that was necessary was the existence of a legitimate opposition party. Because what that does is provide choice for the electorate, but also accountability to those who are in government. And then, obviously, the creation of institutions like the rule of law, a free media. So elections are only part of it. And I think one of the things that we have kind of lost track of, and it's true to some extent in the United States, we're so focused on elections that we've forgotten about governance, which is why is it that people are elected, what is it they're supposed to do? So the question is, I happen to believe that we're all the same. And I never went for the fact that Asians didn't believe in democracy. I think that basically what people everywhere want to be able to make decisions about their own lives. Wherever you live, you want to be able to decide where you live, where you send your children to school. Are you able to have a job? And then that kind of migrates upward to making decisions about who runs your country. And so the question is, do people have the tools to do that? And what is the right answer, so that we at the National Democratic Institute do not believe that American democracy is the answer to everything. Okay. And therefore, we have partnered with other countries that have a somewhat different democratic experience and take groups of people to different places. So for instance, one of the first things we did was the No campaign in Chile. So now there are a lot of people that were part of that went with us to Central and Eastern Europe. Now some of the people from Central and Eastern Europe have gone to North Africa. So right, yep. There is all that. The other part about democracy that is important to understand, it's not an event, it's a process. Believe it or not, we still are working on it in the US. And so I think that that is part of it. And then, to put it back to the development issue, all of us that have been academics, either as students or as professors, have debated what comes first, political development or economic development. They clearly go together. And my simplest answer to that is democracy has to deliver because people want to vote and eat. And so the bottom line is, how does the democratically elected government basically distribute, create and distribute wealth? So for instance, when I was secretary, I went to Venezuela a number of times. It was run by a bunch of tired old men. It was a country that had oil and had money. I can understand how Hugo Chavez got elected. Yeah. And what happened was, he was an indigenous person. It was a majority indigenous country. He initially created a poor people's fund out of the oil wealth. Then it all went to his head, and he forgot about the delivery part of it. But I can understand, democracy does have to deliver. So development and democracy go together, and diplomacy does, in fact, kind of help to oil the way.
So forcing the process, I suppose, is, if I had to interpret to you, would not work. Where do you see, if I can shift but try to link, what do you see as the legacy of Iraq and the attempt to try to inject, therefore, obviously, a rapid transition there? And what does that mean for the choices that are now flowing from that across the Middle East?
Well, let me say that I think that it has complicated matters. I have to say this very frankly, because with Iraq, we militarized democracy. Not we, the other people. And basically what happened was that it's associated with the fact that American troops come in, and I think that in many ways it made it more complicated. What is interesting is that National Democratic Institute actually is in Iraq. The thing that we do, for instance, is we do not propagate we're not ideological. We go in and we kind of provide the tools of the nuts and bolts of democracy, of helping people have discussions, organize alliances, etc. And one of the issues that has happened is we go into places and we say it's really important to build coalitions and compromise, and they look at us and say, yeah, like you guys right now. So at the moment we are not the best example. But the bottom line is that I do think it complicated things a lot. And one of the things that I did write this book, which was called A Memo to the President-elect, at a time that I had no idea who the president was going to be. And I did ultimately give it to President Obama, and I inscribed it with the audacity to hope that this book will be useful to you. But I laid out 5 big umbrella issues. Yep. And one of them was the restoration of the good name of democracy. And I think it's very important because ultimately, and this is from the perspective of the United States, we are better off if other countries are democratic. I think it's more complicated, and it doesn't, not always the right people don't always get elected. It happens in our country. And so the bottom line, though, it is something that ultimately stabilizes countries. And to add to that, if women are politically and economically empowered, the societies are more stable. So I do think that it is important, and Iraq, I think, hurt, there's no question. But we are now watching the evolution of some democratic means in Iraq. There are going to be elections there, and I think that it is a process.
When I know you chair this ASPIN foreign ministers group, former foreign ministers, and I think you did one of your meetings recently in Marrakesh in North Africa. When you look at political Islam, where do you see that fitting in the arc of a shift to more representative government or the process in the Middle East?
I wrote another book about the role of God and religion in foreign policy. And what happened was that I was the first Secretary of State that put Muslim holidays on the official calendar. We began to have iftar dinners and began to understand more what Islam was about. And in fact, a lot of the basis of that book was some of the research that we all did in terms of understanding Islam. In many ways, and one of the things that in doing research for the book later, if one reads the Old Testament, there's some pretty bloody parts in it, and a lot of fighting. There is some of that in the New Testament, and there's some of that in the Quran. However, in all three of the books, there are also very similar language in terms of peace, charity, love, justice, etc. And so I don't think of Islam as a warring religion. It is not. And in fact, in many ways, it has a more democratic basis. I mean, the imams are themselves more independent than churches that are run by popes and archbishops. And so I think it's a real question. So one can't automatically say. What I do think that we are in the middle of is a massive schism in Islam. I think most people didn't know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia, and many people in the non-Muslim world do. And they are going through trying to decide what direction they should go in. And so I do not see a contradiction between Islam and democracy. And in fact, NDI has run a number of conferences about how Islam and democracy can, in fact, not only be compatible, but really does work. But there are other things going on within the Muslim religion, and then we have a tendency to kind of categorize people. Frankly, there are extremists in all three of the Abrahamic religions, and so I think that we have to be very careful in the way that we describe that.
Let me ask you one more question, then I'm going to open up here to the floor and to our guests and members to ask some questions. China, you talked earlier about, I think, the rebalancing of U.S. foreign policy. And China, just to stick with the democracy theme for a second, because I think this is part of the context as you think about America's position in the world, and we have to think about it from a European context as well. There's been a lot of use of the word democracy. And when Joe Bao, before he stood down, would throw this word out, that China's heading in a democratic direction, that it will be a democracy, they seem to mean something else. I'm not sure. I know you travel quite a bit to China. You've met Chinese leaders. What do you think they're grappling with, again, in their stage at the moment? And how stable is it? And are they trying to stop somewhere short of where you think the ideal outcome is? And is that possible?
Well, the truth is, I don't think they've actually sorted it out. I think that they have a huge country to run. Not simple. They have some ethnic differences within the country. They also do have an urban-rural divide. They have a rich-poor divide in a communist country. And they do have pressure at the bottom of their pyramid in terms of, I mean, it's interesting, one reads about now in terms of demonstrations because of the sewage system or pigs in the rivers and their environmental issues and some of their, so that they're trying to figure out what to do with it. I think they have a very serious problem, obviously, which is in order to have an industrialized society, they have to have information. They have to allow people to make decisions about business decisions, and it's very hard, I think, to isolate that from other aspects. To a great extent, they now have what I would call a consumer society, right, which is in some cases becoming a middle class, which then does become, at least in my definition of things, a more political class. And the Communist Party there is trying to figure out what its legitimacy is. And right, to some extent they align themselves with Confucianism, but I think they don't know the answer to this question. And they know in order to keep modernizing that they have to loosen up the system. Partially, they are supported by those who are benefiting from the system. An awful lot of, they have managed to bring the equivalent of the American population out of poverty.
Yeah.
They have an awful lot more, but they have managed something, and I think we're watching the evolution of the system, and they are trying to sort it out. If one reads, for instance, about their 5-year plan of trying to work it out, and they are wrestling with it.
Yep.
I think they thought they were going to have a much smoother transition than they had, and the Beaujolais events and all of that becoming public. What I find interesting, who knows whether it'll stick this way, but Xi Jinping does recognize that he has to do something about the elitist image of the leadership. And so he's tried a lot of kind of populist things in terms of taking away the motorcades and things like that. But it'll be interesting to see. He clearly recognizes that he's got some kind of an issue in keeping his society functional. He does look at what Gorbachev did to the Soviet Union, and that kind of scares them. But I think they're trying to get their head around this question.
If I remember rightly, I think you'll know this history better than me, but I think the Soviet Union was partly brought down by environmental NGOs, were one of the first manifestations of that kind of opposition. So if they see that happening, they must, as you said, worry about the USSR model.
I think one of the hardest parts for everybody in this day and age, and it has something to do with democracies everywhere, is with all the information that is out there, the channels of communication between the people and their leaders has gotten more complicated. And so the National Democratic Institute believes in political parties. But what has happened with social media is all of a sudden there's this kind of plethora of information and demands coming out. And the average person believes that if they put it out on social media, somebody's listening to them. The bottom line is somebody maybe, but not necessarily the leaders. And so they get frustrated, and then there are riots, and then there's no channel of communication. And everybody's dealing with this. Yeah. I mean, it's true in the United States. I call it the Californiization of democracy, a referenda on something. People don't know what the referendum is about. And in Egypt, for instance, is how you get from Tahrir Square to governance. And I'm about, when I leave here Sunday, I'm going out to California to have a meeting. NDI is having a meeting with Silicon Valley to kind of look at how technology is affecting democracy. Yeah. And I don't know what the answer is, but it'll be interesting to see, because it is this kind of, how do you absorb the information that is being created, and what does it do to governance generally?
Look, we've got an enormously rich menu, and I've not been particularly transatlantic about it yet, but I think this is the context that we're grappling with in Europe, in the United States. I think the transatlantic relationship has been described since the end of the Cold War as one that needs to look at common international challenges that we have, and can we approach them together. So I think we've just had a big, fantastic tour d'horizon of many of the global challenges, and we can take a dig into them.